Well, James M. Dorsey is a senior fellow in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, where he focuses on political and social change in the Middle East and North Africa, the impact of change in the Middle East, the impact of change in the Middle East and North Africa on Southeast and Central Asia, the nexus of sports, politics, and society in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Dorsey also co-directs the University of Würzburg's Institute for Fan Culture, a veteran award-winning foreign correspondent whose career focused on ethnic and religious conflict. He's a syndicated columnist and author of The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer blog and a forthcoming book with the same title, you should check out on Amazon, as well as a forthcoming book of essays on the Middle East and North Africa. His topic today, which dovetails very nicely with some of the lectures we've had not only this semester but throughout the year on Middle East politics as well as soccer. I encourage you to go back online. You can see a number of the lectures, not only this semester but in the past. We have quite a few faculty on campus. I see Professor Cropper from the French department as well, who's also a noted sports blogger, who have research interests in sports and international relations related topics. Please join me today in welcoming Mr. James M. Dorsey.
Corey, thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I also want to thank Fred Axelgaard, who's been a phenomenal host and kept me very busy, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for joining me. What I want to do is take you on a whistle tour of what I call the turbulent world of Middle East soccer. But before I do that, I want to take you on a detour into the land of the blind, or if you wish, two lands of the blind. If you look at the world of research into the nexus of sports, politics, and society, what you see basically is that it's the Anglo-Saxon world, including Australia, New Zealand, Britain, of course, and North America, as well as Europe and Latin America, that institutionally researches and recognizes this as a recognized field of study and research. The world between Rabat, Algiers, and Beijing is a void. There is nothing. There are individuals, a few, who do some research into it, but there's nobody who does it structurally. In the world that does look at sports, politics, and society, they look at every part of the world. The Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa. The one part of the world they do not look at is the Middle East and North Africa. And yet, I would argue, and in fact, not only I, but probably one of the first people who looked at this more structurally, a scholar by the name of Sean Lopez, who was at the University of Washington, and whose mentor actually was last night at a dinner from the University of Utah, and unfortunately has just left academia. He was probably one of the very few and one of the first to recognize that nexus. And I want to read you very briefly two quotes that he wrote in a piece, I think it was in the International Journal of Middle East Studies in 2009, where he said, "The study of sports and football in particular, arguably the most popular form of cultural performance in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, has much to add to our current understanding of the social, political, and cultural history of the region." He then went on to express his surprise and dismay at the lack of research into this, given what he called the seminal importance of football and other sports in the region, or the central role athletics play in the formation of national identity in most Middle Eastern and North African countries. I would actually take that statement a step further and say that sports in general and soccer in particular was crucial to the development of the Middle East and North Africa since its introduction to the region in the late 19th, early 20th century. And when I say crucial to the development, what I mean is, as Sean Lopez mentioned, national identity, projection of nationhood, state formation, regime formation, maintaining those regimes in power, and a whole host of battles for various rights, whether it's gender rights, human rights, political rights, ethnic rights. In fact, I think one can say that soccer is written into the DNA of the Middle East. Most major clubs in the Middle East, and with the Middle East I'm not only including the Arab world, but also Israel, Iran, Turkey. Most clubs in the Middle East were associated with some form of political ideology, political goal. Whether it was the anti-colonial, anti-monarchical, nationalist forces versus the pro-monarchy, pro-colonial power, anti-nationalist forces. Look at those divisions live on in the derbies, some of the major derbies in the Middle East and North Africa, which include some of the most violent in the world. If you look at the two major teams in Cairo, Al-Ahli and Al-Zamalek, the two most successful clubs in Africa. Al-Ahli was founded in 1907. It was the club of the nationalists. Its first, one of its first chairmen was Saad Zaghloul, the head of the Wafd Party, which was the nationalist party at the time in Egypt. That is where the students met, who in 1919 staged the Egyptian Revolution that led to Egyptian independence. And its arch rival till today was Zamalek. And Zamalek was, one of its former names was Farouk, the king of Egypt, whose name was Farouk. And it was the club of the British colonial administrators, the monarchists, and those segments of Egyptian society that cooperated with them. The same is repeated in Tehran, where you have Persepolis and Istiklal. Istiklal once was called Taj, which is the, it means the crown. Politics was written into the DNA of those clubs that represented tribal, ethnic, national identities. Look at the Derby in Amman, in Jordan, between Al-Faisaliyah, which is the club of the East Bank Jordanians, club of the kings, and Al-Wehda, which was founded in 1986 in the Palestinian refugee camp by the same name in the Jordanian capital. Or they were associated with ethnic minorities. Think of Traktor Sazi in Tabriz in northern Iran, or Jeunesse Kabyle in Algeria, the Berbers. Or they had ideological connections, whether that was capitalist forces in Turkey, or look at the names of teams in Israel. Most Israeli Jewish teams are either Hapoel, Maccabi, or Beitar, three of the major ideological tendencies within the Zionist movement. To give you a sense of how important soccer is, what I want to do is play briefly a video which will give you it'll give you the atmospherics of what the game is and how much more than a game it is. If we can play that first video graph, that would be great. Can you put sound up a little bit?
مش مجرد جيم، مش مجرد مباراة. العالم، شعوب العالم كلها بتخرج تحتفل أو تخرج للشوارع بالملايين لسببين اتنين فقط لا غير: تغيير واقع سياسي أو تأييد واقع سياسي، أو بسبب مباريات كرة قدم بس.
Okay, thank you. We can cut the video. People come out on the streets for two reasons: either for huge political change or to celebrate a soccer match. That is the importance of soccer. There was a study that was done in 2011 by Chomsky University. It was the first time ever that research was done into why divorce rates were rising in Egypt. And you can guess it. The foremost reason why people divorce in Egypt is soccer. The husband, certainly under the Mubarak regime and the autocracy, there was one thing he lived for. That was the Friday match. And if the choice was a ticket or a meal on the table for a family, it was a ticket. If the choice was a few days away with the family or several tickets, it was several tickets. So the wife had three choices. She was either as fervently supportive of the team as he was, or she was as fervently subservient to her husband, or she said, "I'm out of here, I've had it." Which gives you simply an indication of how important it is. I would describe soccer pitches in the Middle East as battlefields. They're battlefields on multiple levels. They're battlefields for greater political freedoms. They're battlefields for economic, social justice. They're battlefields for human rights, for national rights, for ethnic rights, for gender rights, for labor rights. Nothing in the Middle East, in most Middle Eastern countries, certainly nothing until the popular revolts that have shaken the region over the last several years, nothing evokes the kind of deep-seated passion that religion evokes, with the exception of soccer. Which means that these are public spaces in countries that do not tolerate uncontrolled public space, and in which the regime views itself as the owner of public space. These are public spaces that the government cannot simply shut down. Music was a form of dissent in many parts of the Middle East, and you probably remember that from Saudi Arabia, with underground music. It wasn't really an issue. You threw musicians into prison, nobody really cared. Nobody even really knew. You stopped them at the airport, nobody knew. You couldn't shut down the mosque, and you couldn't shut down the stadium, at least not prior to the popular revolts. Now you can. And so, and again, the world, certainly post 9/11, focused on the mosque, because chocolate hands did not blow up World Trade Towers. But I would argue that a lot of what was happening in terms of the process leading up to the popular revolts was happening on the soccer pitch and not in the mosque. For the autocrat, this posed a challenge. It was a threat, and it was not human. The threat was that you actually had an organized group, committed, increasingly politicized, increasingly street battle party, that not only challenged the regime's authority in the public space, the stadium, it challenged its ownership. It's because its understanding, its vision of the power structure of soccer in the Middle East and North Africa, and where they as organized fans stood within that power structure, meant that they viewed themselves as the only true supporters of the club. So from the regime's point, and they were a threat, because increasingly as this built up, they were the only organized force that consistently, persistently, and regularly confronted the regime physically. And these guys were fearless. They did not care if people died on either side. The only other group in those periods, talking about the last 4 or 5 years before the fall of the Mubarak regime, the only other group that, to some degree, physically resisted the regime were the Bedouins, but they were out in the Sinai, some remote sandbox that nobody cared about. The result of this was, and the confrontation was a confrontation with the security forces. And these are regimes largely that are not military regimes, they are security forces. And the security forces in Egypt were not only a problem for soccer fans in the stadium, they were a problem for soccer fans and their families on a daily basis in the popular neighborhoods of Egyptian cities. So in the last decade, by the start of the 21st century, police and security forces, as in many Middle East and North African countries, but certainly in Egypt, were the most despised, the most hated institution in the country. So here you had a group that, middle class in origin, surfing the internet in the so 2004, 2005, 2006. And as they surfed the internet, they came across like-minded soccer fans, particularly in Italy, and even more importantly in Serbia. Guys who called themselves ultras. And what the ultras stood for was something that was very akin to what they believed. And that was that management is corrupt, pawns of the regime. Players are mercenaries. They'll play for the club that pays them the most. And therefore, the only true supporters were the ultras. Moreover, and so that in itself posed a challenge to the regime. But moreover, they were very specific in what it meant to support a club. They were fiercely independent. You couldn't buy them. If you were a member of the Ultras, you had an obligation to be at the game. And it didn't matter where in the world that game was going to be played. You were there. And they were very aggressive. It's a very artistic form of support. Graffiti, choreographies called TiVos, banners on which they've worked a great deal, lyrics, poetry, music. But it also was a very aggressive form of support. You didn't sit on a chair on a tribune. You were standing in that stadium and you were jumping up and down. And you were chanting very aggressive slogans because you were trying to intimidate the other team. Which also meant that that form of self-assertion was in and of itself a challenge to the regime. A regime that didn't have citizens, it had subjects. And it didn't want groups that would independently express themselves. The fact that these guys challenged the security forces meant that tens of thousands of young men, uneducated, undereducated, unemployed, underemployed, joined the ranks of these rival groups of ultras. My sense is that by the time the popular revolt against Mubarak occurred, the ultras, depending on how you rank the labor movement in Egypt, the ultras were the second or third largest civic group in the country. There are people who will argue that without the ultras, Mubarak probably would still be in power today. And they may be right. The ultras played a key role in the overthrow in terms of breaking down what was called the barrier of fear, sort of psychological barrier, this degree of fear, of intimidation that essentially turned most Middle Eastern, North Africans into silent discontents, too afraid to express an opinion because the risk was too high. There were two phases of breaking down that barrier of fear. One was, if you look at who was on Tahrir Square, or for that matter, in Tunis, or on Pearl Square in Manama, on Tahrir, the great mass of people had never done this before. They had never left their home to express publicly an opinion against the government, let alone camp out on the square, let alone stand up to the security forces. So the first phase of breaking that barrier of fear was getting people to leave their homes. A young guy called Mohammed Hassan, one of the founders of the Ultras White Knights, which is the militant support group of Zamalek in Cairo. He's a computer engineering student, dreams of becoming a photographer, and on the 25th of January, he was in a popular neighborhood of Cairo. They gathered 300 people, and they started marching towards Tahrir Square. And because the ultras were not the only ones that did it, but they were one of the key groups that led the marches to the square. And because he was an ultra, because he was someone who had stood up to the regime, and because he was such a passionate supporter of a very popular club, by the time he and his people reached Tahrir, there were a group of 10,000. They had smashed through a sequence of 7 barricades of security and police forces. In other parts of Cairo, the security forces tried to close the exits to the neighborhood so people couldn't leave. And you would have ultras on the rooftops throwing Molotov cocktails to force the exits open. There was a second phase of breaking down that barrier of fear, and that was on the square itself. That really started on the 28th of January of 2011. So you're this regular Joe Smith, never done this before. You're on the square, your second or third day there, and the security forces attack. What do? Your instinct is run. But then you have this outer perimeter around the square of ultras who weren't going to budge. And they were well prepared for this. They had projectile machines that could project projectiles. They had quartermaster crews who supplied the projectiles. They had the so-called Sayadun, the hunters, who would never really happened in Egypt before, who would take a tear gas canister and throw it right back into the ranks of the police. This had never happened to the police, and the police were in disarray because they were not prepared for it. They were not prepared for it psychologically. They were not prepared for it in terms of equipment. So if you have these kind of guys who you respect, both for their courage as well as for their loyalty to the team, who are you to leave the square? And so that's why a lot of people stayed on that square. And it's also why a lot of people, there are a lot of people who will argue that without the ultras, the revolt hadn't taken place. The Ultras played a very important role in the post-Mubarak period too. The guys who first stormed the offices of the state security services, which was part of that hated security apparatus, were the Ultras. The guys who stormed the Israeli embassy in September of 2011 were the Ultras. You had, over those months, continuous, massive demonstrations of vast groups of Egyptians on all kinds of issues, including against the military regime, the one that succeeded Mubarak and was there to take the country to free and fair elections. One of those mass demonstrations was in November 2011. For one of the very few times where the Ultras were not present on the square. And on a Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, there was a sort of dialectic process that took place. It was becoming clear that the security forces were going to attack. And calls went out from the square to the Ultras saying help. And at the very same time, there was a discussion among the Ultras whether or not they should intervene. And there was basically a decision that they were going to stand up. The reason being that they had, part of their ethos by then was a zero tolerance for what they viewed as abuse and mistreatment, because they felt that they had been abused and mistreated in the stadia for the last several years. And so they decided to engage. And they did. But once that battle was over, there was suddenly a parting of the ways. You had these massive Egyptians who were protesting whatever it was. And you had the youth groups and the Ultras who decided that they were going to go in the interior ministry, because that was what represented the security force. And you had a vicious 5-day street battle in Shah Mohammed Mahmoud. You had on the one hand the square protesting totally independent, and there was no connection between the two. There's a vicious street battle for access to the interior ministry. More than 40 people were killed, more than 1,000 were wounded. By that time, Egyptians were getting protest weary. The economy was going down, security was a mess. The revolt was not producing, there had been no management of expectations. The revolution had not produced what they wanted. And Egyptians were looking for a way to get back to some normalcy, to some form of, to some ability to return to economic growth. And protesting youth groups, protesting Ultras, didn't fit quite into that pattern. And I think that was what laid the ground for February 1, 2012, which was a politically laden brawl in the stadium of Port Said, at the end of which 74 fans, supporters, Ultras of Al-Ahly in Cairo were dead. I don't think that this happened spontaneously. To be fair, I also don't think that anybody sat down and said, this is what I want to happen, and I want to see 74 bodies at the end of it. I think what I do think was that there was a decision to teach the Ultras a lesson, and the decision got out of hand and backfired. I want to briefly talk about a couple of other things and give some time to questions, but let me just round up Egypt by saying that depending how things go, I think we're returning to square one with, in terms of what is happening post the overthrow last summer of Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brother president of Egypt, and the rise of the military again. You're again seeing no public space. And you're again seeing a pattern of eruption, of confrontation between the football fans and the security forces. There have been multiple of those over the last few months. There have been very clear statements on the part of the ultras that they will not take this lying down. The role of soccer fans is something that repeats itself across the Middle East and North Africa. Algeria. Anti-French protests in the 1920s were in football. Algerian independence. You had a civil war from a war for the national liberation from 1954 to 1962, in which 1 million people were killed. The FLN, the National Liberation Front, announced its armed struggle at the World Cup. Shortly thereafter, 10 French players, Algerians in fact, some of whom were slated to play in the French national team in the World Cup, clandestinely left France, and they formed the FLN national team. The national team toured the world, played 63 matches, won most of them, and that was part of what put the struggle for liberation on the map. You go to Algeria today, there's a tacit understanding. The protests are in the stadium. Bouteflika is denounced every week. The real fear is how long you can keep it in the stadium. Saudi Arabia. It was fan pressure that for the first time in the history of the Gulf, public pressure forced a member of the ruling family to resign. It was the prince who was head of the Saudi National Football Association. The prince still is in control because he is also the head of the presidency for youth and sport. But nonetheless, this was the first time that not only that a prince was forced to resign, a member of the ruling family, but also that in a country that sees elections as an invention of the infidels, was forced to hold a free and fair election in the association, in which the candidate who won was not the government's candidate, and in fact was a reformer. I want to briefly, because a lot of you probably at one point or other have seen it in the media and in the news, talk briefly about Qatar and the 2022 World Cup. But I'm going to do that in stenographic style so we have a little time for questions. Football, sports, the World Cup for Qatar, it has nothing to do with the game. And it has everything to do with defense and security policy. Qataris learned a lesson in 1990 when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. They learned two lessons. Lesson number one was that Kuwait, a similar state, was able to marshal the international community to come to its aid when it needed them. The Kuwaitis could sit in the casino in Cairo, while the Americans, the Egyptians, and whoever else liberated them. The second lesson that the Qataris learned was that the Saudi defense umbrella, as it existed at the time, wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And at the same time, they understood that it doesn't really matter what amount of arms and how sophisticated a weaponry they would put in place, or how many Pakistanis, Jordanians, whatever it was, they would recruit to populate the rank and file of their army and security forces. Qatar will never be able to defend itself in terms of hardcore defense. So the only alternative is soft subtle power. If you look at the last 20 years of Qatar, they built a world-class broadcaster that it wouldn't have mattered how much money they would have paid to an international PR agency. That agency would never have been able to put them on the map the way Al Jazeera did. They built a world-class airline. They are high profile in their investments. foreign investments, real estate, stakes in major Fortune 500 companies, the museums that they are building, their mediation efforts across the region, being the good citizen of the region. But what better way of embedding yourself into multiple levels of the international community than soccer, the most popular form of cultural entertainment? Keep in mind that 5% of the world's population is in one way or another involved in soccer. That's what it's about. I think that what they had not counted with is, or many had not realized, is that the World Cup is something that cuts both ways. It gives the Qataris prestige, leverage, visibility, but it also makes them vulnerable to various pressures. And it positions the World Cup as an agent of change. I think, in fact, I would argue that what the World Cup is producing is probably the monkey wrench for social and political change in the world. And it's doing so by focusing on the labor issue. In other words, you've got, what, 12% of the population, you've got our citizens, 88% are foreigners. The vast majority of those foreigners are skilled, semi-skilled labor, and unskilled labor, work under horrendous working and housing conditions. A migration cycle that is onerous by definition, because by the time they arrive in the country, they are deeply indebted. Changing that, you know, there was a lot about the issue of foreign workers in Sochi in the run-up to the Winter Olympics this year. You could have easily changed that. Nothing in Russia would have changed. You change those arrangements in Qatar, one that has it will without doubt have a domino effect in the region. But more importantly, you're changing the social and political structure of the country, in which 88% of the population is there to do a job and leave. They have no rights. The moment you start giving them rights, you start a dynamic that you no longer can control. And so I think that probably in terms of the potential of change, this is the most important thing that's happened in the recent history of the Gulf. Thank you.
A little bit under 10 minutes for some questions. Please mind queuing up the mic. Tell us your name, what you're studying, and feel free to ask your questions now. One sports blogger to another.
I'm Corey Cropper from the Department of French and Italian. I just wonder what you have made of Bob Bradley being the manager of the Pharaohs over the last couple of years. I know he recently stepped down or was dismissed, but was there any kind of impact in American perceptions of soccer in the Middle East that evolved because of his engagement there, or changes in perception of America in Egypt because of his involvement there?
Look, I think he did a phenomenal job. My understanding was that he was less liked in the United States because he was viewed as aloof, as distant. He was everything but that in Egypt. And he stuck it out in a very difficult period. Not only did he stick it out, but he was deeply engaged. He was socially engaged. He was outspoken on the issues. He went out to the families of the dead, and he was greatly appreciated. I think he helped bring Egypt as far as it came, despite when it indeed lost the ability to go to the World Cup in Brazil this year. It just simply broke down. in Ghana. The pressures were too high. This was a few months after about 650 people had been killed in one day on Lavia Square in August of last year when the military regime and the security forces cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood protesters who were protesting the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi as president. I don't think they deserve to be punished, but that's the way things go in the Middle East. I don't really have, to be quite honest, a perception of what Americans, and to what degree American perceptions, to the extent that they existed, were of soccer in the Middle East, and in terms of how Bradley had an impact on them. I do think that Bradley was greatly appreciated by Egyptians. He was greatly appreciated for the fact that he stayed. There were other foreign coaches, Dutchmen and others, who didn't stay. And he was greatly appreciated for his degree of engagement. But you've also got to understand, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that animosity towards the United States as it exists in the Middle East and North Africa, including Egypt, is not an animosity on a one-to-one level. On a one-to-one level, you will not encounter it. It's an animosity towards a perceived policy or an understanding of a policy, which is very seldom, including in Iran, and I've lived in Iran, been translated into individual relations. So that relationship for, let's say, people to people was fairly healthy even before Bradley was there. But without doubt, he made a contribution.
Kind of comparatively, how would you say the political ties in soccer in the Middle East? How would you compare those to the political ties in other developing nations, like in other African countries that are developing still?
Let me put it this way. Certainly across the Middle East and North Africa, political control of soccer is almost absolute. Look at who runs the associations of the Gulf. They're all members of the ruling family, bar none, except for Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Across the rest of the region, it's the regime's cronies who are there. That's true for a lot of Africa too. It was last year that the Confederation of African Football decided that you could only run for the presidency of the regional governing body if you were a member of its executive committee. Need I say more?
My name is Isaac Pootery. I'm a political science major. I'm just wondering if individual soccer players in these areas publicize their political stance and what pull they have.
What sets Arab dictatorships, Arab autocracies apart, in my mind, from most other dictatorships that we've seen in Africa and Asia, in Latin America, is what a Palestinian-American scholar by the name of Hisham Sharabi described as neo-patriarchy. And what he meant by that was that the autocrat is the father of the nation, and he franchises his autocracy. The prime minister is a father. The governor of the province is a father. The village mukhtar, the village head, is a father. And then you, of course, have the authoritarian father of the nuclear family. If you look at how Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi responded to the popular protests, it was the father who was talking to his children, who had gotten out of line, and he no longer understood what was happening. And in fact, he addressed them as sons and daughters. And just like parents who have an adolescent child and just don't know how to deal with it. Because he at the same time associated himself with the soccer field teams. Soccer players, by and large, saw the autocrat as their followers. They had a vested interest. They won, they were showered with gifts. And gifts meaning real estate, expensive cars, $1 million, whatever it may be. So by and large, you did not see soccer players engaging. It was standing aside. There were a few exceptions. I'll mention 3. You had in, I believe it was June of 2011 in Libya, when 17 soccer players joined the rebels in the revolt. But if you look at the reasons why they joined, it's much like suicide bombers. They had a family member or a friend who had died. And that was their rupture point with the regime. In Bahrain, it was different, because in Bahrain, it ultimately became a sectarian issue, and you had a majority Shiite population wanting equal rights, and soccer players were among those who stood up for that. In fact, today Bahrain has 2 pro soccer teams in prison. One a professional team and one an amateur team. The leader of the revolt in Homs in Syria was a young man by the name of Dorsey, who was the national youth team's goalkeeper. But there are exceptions. Ibrahim Hassan, a storied Egyptian soccer player, was until not too long ago board member of Somalia. He led demonstrations against the demonstrators on Tahrir Square. That was his loyalty to the regime.
Final questions?
Brett Sherwood, undeclared major. In certain countries that I've been in, such as Serbia, I've seen that certain religious groups have endorsed certain soccer clubs. Do you see that in the Middle East? And if so, what does it do to the religious climate?
Serbia was less a religious endorsement, it was nationalist endorsement, and in fact, soccer was at the beginning of the Yugoslav wars, as you probably know. Let me approach this differently. There's not really a question of endorsement religiously, yes or no. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did at one point consider forming its own clubs, and then decided against that and decided for trying to get rid of club elections. The one really only explicitly religious league that you have is the Islamic Football League in Israel, which was deliberately established so as not to be part of the Israeli league. However, what you do have, and unfortunately there wasn't a lot of time to go into that, is soccer is a major issue of debate within the Salafi and jihadist community. In fact, when it came to soccer, Osama bin Laden was a moderate. He was a fanatic soccer supporter. He had his own soccer teams. In Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets, and in Sudan, and he was there in exile. And he was a moderate because he understood the recruitment and bonding characteristics of soccer, as does Ismail Haniyeh in Gaza, as does Sam Nasrallah in Lebanon, as opposed to the Taliban, the Shabab. So there, and you have vast religious debates. In fact, in my book, I have a whole chapter on it, in which you have a fatwa that was issued by Saudi Salafi clerics, in which they rewrite the rules of the game, so that it's no longer the game of the infidels. No longer goalposts, clothing changes, no cursing, all kinds of things.
the last question, Eric?
My name is Eric, and I studied Middle East and Arabic and NGO management. And I'm wondering how soccer and the soccer culture that exists in the Middle East might better be seen or utilized as a catalyst or an instrument for development of the Middle Eastern nations. Thank you.
You know, well, we had some discussion about that yesterday. There's a lot of talk about using soccer, using sport for peace, for development, for love, whatever it may be. I'm not a great believer in it. What I mean with that is, and this is not just in the Middle East, I know that, but I can use it in this. If you have an environment, and you've shaped that environment already, that is moving towards a peaceful settlement of whatever conflict that may be, of bridging gaps, of developing, then sports and soccer is a great tool. But without that, it's not going to cut it. In 2007, Iraq, at the height of its violence, won the Asian Cup. A Shiite player passed the ball to a Sunni player, and the Kurd struck the goal, or whichever sequence of events of the minority it was. And Iraqis were out in the streets. People who hadn't spoken for years hugged each other. Now, listen, united the country. 24 hours later, they were back at it. So, with other words, that is not going to create the momentum. You have to have that momentum, and then this will help you further, or can help you further.
Thanks for your questions, and thanks, James Dorsey.